Welcome everyone, my name is Dr. Herrera. I am the founder of Escalia Health, an elite level functional nutrition and coaching service, and I'm also the creator of the Metabolic Mastery Project, of which you're currently partaking in. Now in today's video, we're going to be talking about what is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD for short. And specifically, we're going to start by actually defining what non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is. We're also going to be talking about the different stages of NAFLD and how they develop. We're also going to be discussing the actual survival rate of those that have NAFLD at each stage. And finally, we're going to be discussing briefly what other conditions can actually cause NAFLD or are related to NAFLD. Really important stuff. So let's get started. So what is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD for short? Now, the first thing I want you to understand is that NAFLD, the term NAFLD, is actually an umbrella term or a blanket term used to describe an entire range of liver diseases, including things like NASH, fibrosis, cirrhosis, etc. The other thing I want you to understand is about 25% or so of the population in the United States currently has some level of NAFLD. And also, as an added note, about 25% of the entire population on Earth actually also has some level of NAFLD. It is quickly becoming, if not already, has become the #1 reason of liver disease, outpacing even things like alcoholism, which is kind of crazy to think about. Now, specifically in the United States, roughly about 80 million people have some level or some stage of NAFLD. Now, NAFLD, like I said, refers to an entire range of fatty liver disease, and where it starts is in stage 1. Right? And stage 1 is typically referred to as simple steatosis. Now, steatosis simply means the accumulation of fat, in this case within the liver and liver cells. Now, simple steatosis, the official definition of it and the official diagnosis of it is a liver that contains 5% or more liver fat within its cells. So 5% of your liver is actually fat, right? Simple enough. Now, the thing I want you to understand about stage 1 or simple steatosis is that it's not life-threatening. Most people have it. A ton of people have it, apparently, right? Now, but what you do need to understand is that when you start to accumulate fat, especially when you start to cross the threshold of 5% or more, you're more likely to actually be developing other health issues such as insulin resistance, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. Maybe you're starting to gain unwanted weight. And this is where it kind of starts to begin to develop, right? This is the beginning stages of it. And if you do nothing to adjust your nutrition or your lifestyle or change the things that you need to change about your life, then this can set you up to develop more serious levels of this condition and also other health issues as well, which we will be covering here in a little bit. Now, let's say that you're at stage 1 and you do nothing to change your nutrition, your lifestyle, etc., and you allow the fat to build up within your liver past 5% into 10, 20, 30% and above. At some point, you're going to cross the threshold and go from simple steatosis to what's called NASH. Now, NASH stands for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, right? The key word being hepatitis. Hepa means liver, itis means inflammation. So anytime you see the term itis in any medical terminology, we're talking about inflammation. And specifically here, we're talking about inflammation of your liver cells. Now, this is where things get a little more exciting and not in a good way. Once you've accumulated enough fat in your liver and you start to develop NASH, what tends to happen is that because you have so much fat within the liver cells themselves, your liver's immune system, because it has its own immune system, will start to look at all that excess fat and say, wow, there's a ton of this. It's reaching toxic levels. We need to do something to get rid of it. And it'll actually start to look and see the fat accumulation in your liver as a foreign invader. So the immune system will treat it just like how it would treat a bacterial infection or a viral infection or parasites or anything like that, right? And when that happens, the immune system in your liver will start to actually attack the excess amounts of fat within the liver cells. Now, because the fat is actually stored within the liver cells themselves, your immune system will actually start to attack your liver cells and start to destroy them. And it'll start to create massive amounts of inflammation, because anytime you have an immune response you're also going to have inflammation. That's just part of it. Now, at stage 2, which is NASH, this is starting to develop and it's starting to grow and get worse and worse and worse. You start to develop a ton of inflammation and a ton of damage is starting to occur within the liver cells, which is not good. Another thing that you need to understand is that roughly 3 to 6% of people that have simple steatosis will actually graduate to NASH, of course, if you don't do anything about it. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that may not seem like a lot, 3 to 6%, but it's actually, I mean, when you look at 80 million people that have this, you're talking about roughly 5 or 6 million people that will go from stage 1 and progress to stage 2, which is a lot. Now, let's say that you're at stage 2 and you still haven't done anything to change your nutrition, your lifestyle, exercise, etc. What will eventually happen is that as this inflammation continues and as your cells become more damaged, they will start to be replaced with scar tissue. Just like how when you cut yourself on your hand or on your arm or wherever, and your skin cells are damaged and they quickly get replaced with scar tissue, a similar thing happens with NASH and your liver once it gets to the stage. Now, when enough scar tissue starts to build up, right, you now are starting to enter the third stage of NAFLD, which is fibrosis. Now, fibrosis means that a large part of your liver is now becoming scar tissue. And there's different levels of fibrosis. If you're familiar with the FIB-4 score, like F1, F2, F3, etc. We'll go into more detail as to what those mean in other videos. But basically what you need to understand is that scarring is beginning here. We're starting to see scarring in your actual liver because of the ton of damage that's occurring from the excessive inflammation and other factors as well, but mainly from the inflammation. The other thing you need to understand about fibrosis is that this is where the prognosis starts. This is where a doctor will actually start to evaluate your chances of surviving this, right? This is where things start to get complicated, right? In stage 1 and stage 2, these are very reversible. The research is very clear that you can actually reverse this pretty quickly just by adjusting your diet and exercise. But once you start to hit fibrosis, you can still reverse it and it can still improve, but it becomes harder and becomes more complicated because of the scarring and a bunch of other things that occur during this phase. Now, another thing you have to understand too is that from those that have NASH, about 12% will actually progress from NASH to fibrosis, right? The number and the percentage is getting bigger, which is kind of, which should point out to a little trend here that the worse you get, the easier it becomes for you to actually progress to each disease. Really important to understand. Now, let's say that you're still on the road to developing this disease and you still haven't done anything to adjust your nutrition, your diet, etc. Then eventually you're going to progress from stage 3, which is fibrosis, to stage 4, which is cirrhosis. Now, this is where things get dangerous because at cirrhosis, your liver is now mostly scar tissue. It is non-functioning liver cells. Just like how when you cut yourself on your arm and those damaged cells get replaced by scar tissue, that scar tissue is no longer skin cells. It's no longer a functioning skin cell. Same thing happens in your liver. When your liver cells get replaced with scar tissue, those are no longer functioning liver cells. And so the overall function of your liver gets drastically reduced, which is super dangerous for a bunch of different reasons. So your liver is mostly scar tissue. You can start to see necrotic damage, so literally parts of your liver will start to die. It is generally understood that once you get to this stage, it is usually irreversible or permanent damage. Not always the case, but generally speaking, that seems to be the trend. And this is where you're gonna need things like transplants, like liver transplants, because just of the sheer dysfunction that your liver is experiencing. Now, another thing I want you to understand is that about 20% of people that have fibrosis will actually progress to cirrhosis. That's a big jump because if you remember, from NASH to fibrosis, about 12% of people progress. But once you cross that threshold, it becomes super easy. Up to 20% of people will actually go into cirrhosis, right? Important to understand. And then finally, if cirrhosis is allowed to get worse and worse and worse, eventually you'll reach more end-stage levels of liver disease, which includes things like cancer and, of course, death, which we want to avoid. So now let's talk about survival rate. What are the chances of you surviving NAFLD? Well, survival rate depends on the severity of fibrosis. Remember when I said that fibrosis is where your prognosis starts, is when your doctor starts to evaluate the chances of survival? That starts at stage 3 fibrosis. When it comes to simple steatosis or NASH, these aren't life-threatening conditions. These aren't going to kill you in and of themselves. But if they're allowed to cross over into fibrosis and beyond, then yeah, the chances of your survival actually go down. And specifically, if we look at the data, if we look at the research, the 10-year survival rate of mild fibrosis, like if you have a mild form of fibrosis, let's say F1, F2, is about 90%, right? Got a 90% survival rate, which is good, right? That's not horrible. But you'll notice that as your fibrosis advances, the chances of your survival goes down. A 10-year survival rate of advanced fibrosis, once you start to hit F4, for example, it's 85%. The 10-year survival of cirrhosis is 75%. It just gets lower and lower and lower from there. Now, again, the prognosis starts at fibrosis, right? It starts at stage 3. This is where if you're anywhere on this side of the range, then you have a really good chance of reversing your condition and getting better. If you go from fibrosis and above, it becomes much harder and you have to do more work. So if you find yourself here or in the early stage of fibrosis, you have to make the decisions now to adjust your nutrition and your lifestyle accordingly in order to improve this. Now, all this may sound a bit scary, which I totally understand, and it should sound scary. I mean, this is a very, very serious condition that you should be taking extremely seriously for your own health. However, I want you to understand something, that most people with NAFLD actually have a much higher chance of dying from other metabolic issues such as cardiovascular disease, or CVD for short here, which is really important to understand. Because when you develop NAFLD, this range of disease doesn't happen in isolation. It doesn't happen just by themselves. They're usually a result of other conditions that you're going through metabolically. For example, I have included a list of other diseases that are often linked to or related to or can actually even cause NAFLD to progress or develop. The first one is obesity. That is by far the most common disease that will contribute to the development of NAFLD. If you are medically obese, you are at a very high risk. The other condition is metabolic syndrome, right? Which many of you are probably familiar with. Metabolic syndrome includes things such as hypertension, high cholesterol, insulin resistance, increased abdominal fat, right? And all of those factors will contribute to the development of NAFLD. Oftentimes, NAFLD will actually even trigger the development of these conditions as well. Type 2 diabetics. If you have type 2 diabetes, you're at an increased risk because of all the metabolic dysfunction that's occurring with your pancreas and your insulin, and etc. Women who have polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS, are also at high risk, and they're heavily linked to the development of NAFLD. Of course, genetics plays a big part as well, especially if you're Hispanic American or Native American or of East Asian descent, or European American as well, or of European descent. You'll have a higher risk of developing NAFLD, and we'll go into more specific details as to genetics and other root causes in other videos. Hypothyroid, if you have hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, etc., you're more likely to develop it. Menopause isn't a disease, but women who reach menopause also have an increased risk of developing NAFLD. People with gout, chronic kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, especially cancer of the colon, of the pancreas, of breast cancer in women, and of the stomach. All of these conditions will contribute and be linked to the development, or it can even cause NAFLD. And in future videos, I will be diving deeper into each one of these disease states so that you can understand the relationship between, let's say, gout and fatty liver disease, or PCOS and fatty liver disease. And I can give you more direct and specific guidance on how to deal with that from a nutritional lifestyle standpoint. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in this video is something that I'm asked about often, and that is how quickly can NAFLD progress? In other words, how quickly can someone go from stage 1 simple steatosis all the way to cirrhosis and beyond? Now, traditionally, it was thought that developing end-stage liver diseases like cirrhosis took decades, especially in the case of, let's say, alcoholism. However, the current research in regards to NAFLD shows that you can go from stage 1 steatosis to cirrhosis and beyond in as little as 3 to 7 years. 3 to 7 years. That's scary. That means some people out there can go from stage 1 to cirrhosis in just 3 years, right? This is a very aggressive, very potent liver disease. And if anything, this fact alone should motivate you to make the necessary lifestyle and nutrition changes that you can now so you can avoid the progression of this disease and potentially save your life. Okay, Escalia family, that is it for today's video. Let me know what you thought about the content in the comment section, and I will see you in the next one.